Hi guys, welcome to Year 13 History. I hope you and your families are keeping safe. Um, for those of you that don't know me, my name is Mr. Desi and I'll be teaching you the non-exam assessment. So the coursework throughout Year 13, which will be based on the making of modern India from 1857, so that's the Great Rebellion, the Indian Mutiny, all the way to 1947, so the partition of India, which leads to the creation of India and Pakistan as new nation states. It might be a good idea for you guys to take notes whilst watching this video. When we do get back to school, you will have one lesson a week with me where we'll focus on planning, splitting ourselves up into groups to discuss our readings and inquiry question, working on actually writing up our coursework and receiving feedback and responding to the feedback that I provide you with. For the purposes of remote learning, however, you will have a lesson every Tuesday and work will therefore be due in for the following Tuesday in preparation for your next lesson. Now, your Nazis and your tutors teachers will therefore set you 1 hour less work over the fortnight to account for the extra work that you're doing for the NEA. Just a little bit about myself. I actually wrote my dissertation in March 2018 on the making of modern India, and that centered on how different schools of thought explain Indian communalism from the pre-colonial period all the way up until the post-independence period. Now, your NEA, your historical inquiry, is your chance to really start thinking and writing like a historian. It is the first essay that you're completing that will be in the format of an academic style essay, an undergraduate style essay, which you'll be completing when you eventually go to university. So it will require you to reference different secondary sources, primary sources, and also the work of professional academic historians. Okay, so it'll put you in a good sort of position to begin writing academic undergraduate style essays when you eventually get to university. So your NEA word limit is 4,500 words. Now the NEA is split into 3 different assessment objectives: AO1, AO2, and AO3. So the word limit is 4,500 words, and your NEA is marked out of 40. So 50% of those marks are for your knowledge and understanding, okay? And that requires you to communicate and sustain an argument in relation to your chosen question across that 100-year period. So 20 out of those 40 marks will be based on your AO1. Your AO2 will be the analysis and the evaluation of 3 different types of primary sources, and that will account for 10 out of those 40 marks. Your AO3 will be the analysis and evaluation of 2 differing historians' interpretations, okay? So AO1 to begin with. Now, the main thing you need to think about here and realize here is that you are already using these skills, okay? These skills should already be familiar to you, and in all of your essay subjects, you should be aiming to obviously communicate knowledge and understanding, but also to make sure that you're sustaining an argument in your introduction, you're outlining your argument, you're sustaining that argument throughout your main body paragraphs, and you're reinforcing that argument in your conclusion. So your aim is to sustain an argument across the entire coursework, so across the 4,500 words. Now, I suggest that you spend around 2,700 words on your AO1 so that you're able to obviously get that sort of breadth across the 100-year period, but so that you're also able to go into depth on many of the key sort of events within that 100-year period. Your AO2, that will account for 10 out of 40 marks. You'll spend approximately 1,000 words analysing and evaluating 3 different types of primary sources. So that could be newspapers, speeches, political cartoons, etc., etc. So these primary sources, the analysis and evaluation of them is similar to the sources that you're analysing already for the Nazi-style exam questions, okay? So you'll be analysing the utility, the value of those primary sources by coming to an overall judgment, and you'll be focusing on the analysis and evaluation of provenance, content, and the tone and the style of the source as well. Your AO3, which will account for around 800 words of your NEA, that will require you to analyse and evaluate 2 different historical interpretations, okay? So 2 differing historical interpretations offered by 2 different historians, okay? And obviously you will be evaluating them in light of the time and context in which those interpretations were written, and you'll be trying to focus on the sort of limitations that those historical interpretations may have. Obviously, we'll go into a little bit more depth when we attempt to actually tackle these different assessment objectives. So for your AO1, we'll be aiming to get those 2,700 words approximately complete between September and December. Your AO2, the analysis and evaluation of 3 primary sources, that will be completed from Jan to February 2021. And then your AO3, the analysis and evaluation of historical interpretations, the 800 words, that should be completed in March. And then after that, we'll just be focusing on making sure our NEA is the best that it can be before it is sent off to AQA, the exam board. Right, the purpose of the historical investigation. Now, one of the most important things here is that this is an independent coursework unit, okay? You will be required to source primary sources yourself. You'll be required to source those 2 different historical interpretations yourself. And you will be going on this independent study, consulting various different secondary sources for content, primarily by yourselves, okay? So it really puts you in a good position for writing academic style university essays when you begin uni. Now, the purpose of this historical investigation is for students to develop an enhanced understanding of the nature and purpose of history as a discipline and how historians work. So what you'll be focusing on is a different sort of method, the different methods that historians sort of implement and carry out to arrive at their own conclusions, okay? So you'll be asking relevant and significant questions about the past and undertaking research independently. You're developing then as independent learners and critical and reflective thinkers. You'll be acquiring an understanding of the nature of historical study, and you'll be organizing, communicating their knowledge and understanding in a piece of your own sustained writing, okay? So that basically means that you'll be sustaining an argument according to the sort of knowledge and understanding that they've presented, or the knowledge and understanding that you've uncovered in many of the different pieces of work that you've read, and you'll be trying to sustain an argument in relation to your inquiry question, in relation to your coursework question throughout your NEA. So thinking like a historian. Now, this historical inquiry process, you can look at this in your own time, but this is essentially the process which historians really undertake to find things out about the past, okay? So you can look at this, and you'll be undertaking a similar sort of inquiry process to ensure that you're in a good position to answer your own inquiry question. We'll also be thinking about different note-taking techniques, so learning how to synthesize academic texts, how to use secondary sources to find sort of factual information which can support your own arguments, and then you'll also be thinking about how you can analyze and evaluate the work of other historians, okay? Writing like a historian. So the historical inquiry, and this is really, really important, the historical inquiry will require you to sustain an argument across a long essay. So for those of you that study politics with me, for those of you who obviously had Mr. Trajan for the Nazis, Mr. Clavin for the Nazis, Mr. Ahmed and Mr. Karrenbachs for the Tudors, you know that in history, for the essay questions, for the 25-mark essay questions, you will be required to sustain an argument, okay, throughout that essay, okay? So presenting and sustaining a historical argument is one of the things we find the hardest in Year 12, okay? So we need to go back and think about what an argument actually is. Okay, so history is an argument without end. Now, this is something for you to think about and research, and I'll be quite interested to see what ideas you come up with. What does this quote mean? History is argument without end. To count his historical knowledge, the stories we tell about the past have to relate to historical sources, so the archives of the past. The archives don't speak for themselves, but it's the historian's job, okay, in their own inquiry process to interpret those sources, to interpret those archives, and make factual claims based on their interrogation of those archives, okay? So in doing this, in conducting this process, okay, they are constructing a historical argument. Evaluating historical argument. So an argument is an attempt to establish a conclusion and the reasons proposed to reach that conclusion. Okay, to understand a historical argument, you need to understand firstly what the historian is trying to establish. Okay, so what is that historian's argument specifically? Okay, what reasons are offered in order to establish that conclusion? So what reasons does that historian provide us with? In which they reach that specific argument, in which they reach that conclusion. So, in other words, what evidence do they have to back up that specific argument? Okay. Lastly, how effectively do the two fit together? So, do the reasons offered, does the evidence provided offered, does it really support the argument? Okay. That is the point at which you're beginning to evaluate the argument. To critically analyze and evaluate an argument, you need to unpick, you need to decipher whether the evidence provided for the historian's argument, whether the two really fit together. So there's two signs of a weak argument. If it is possible to derive a different conclusion from the reasons on which the argument depends, okay? And secondly, if there's an over-reliance on assumptions, so reasons or evidence that are taken for granted and not explicitly stated in the argument. Now, this is an activity that I'll require you to do for next Tuesday's lesson. So this is just interpreting the Nazi seizure of power and the role of the Gestapo. So it's an exercise to develop an understanding of historical argument. Okay, so this exercise aims to develop the ability to evaluate an historical argument by looking closely at how it has been constructed. Okay, and the reason why I'm getting you to do this is because it links in, it ties in with what you're doing at the moment for the Nazi module currently. Okay, so now what we'll be doing is evaluating Robert Galatelli's argument. Okay, so the Nazis are warning from history. So the main conclusion reached by Robert Galatelli is that the Nazis won power legally, okay, and they ruled more by consent than coercion. Okay, so the reasons given in the documentary are as follows. A surprising picture of how the Gestapo operated in the Wurzburg emerges when the files are studied. The Gestapo were thin on the ground rather than numerous. There were only 28 secret police officials for the entire Wurzburg region of nearly 1 million people. The Gestapo could not have operated without cooperation of the citizens of Germany. There were simply not enough Gestapo officials to go around. Between 80 to 90% of the crimes that were reported to the Gestapo came from ordinary citizens. The main job for the Gestapo was sorting out the denunciations. Okay, so what I've done here is that I've modelled an evaluation of Galatelli's argument. So quite a lot is being assumed in this argument. It is assumed that it was known at the time that there were only 28 Gestapo in the region in question. This seems to be a fairly fatal assumption to make without further evidence being offered, given that the Gestapo were by definition the secret state police and an organisation whose membership lists were not in the public domain. So one could equally conclude that we cannot say anything about the knowledge of the average German about the size of the Gestapo simply on the basis of what we now know about the actual size of the police force. Indeed, we might perhaps want to claim that the Gestapo were clearly very effective indeed at terrorizing people. A key point about terror is that it involves the unknown and fear of the unknown. Further assumptions have also been made. What, for example, is the assumed definition of cooperation here? Can I be said to cooperate with you if I consent to what you ask me to do, or what I think you expect me to do out of fear, or would another word be more appropriate for my actions? Okay. So your task here, okay, and I've provided the link to the article here, is to read pages 57 to 64 of this article based on coercion and consent, written by Richard Evans. Now, I know you've been reading a little bit of Richard Evans. I know that Mr. Clavin and Mr. Trudgeon have provided you with some Richard Evans to read. So this will actually build on your knowledge of historiography, okay, and working with professional academic historians' interpretations and their views. So what I would like you to do is read pages 57 to 64 of the article, and I need you to complete the worksheet attached, which requires you to critically evaluate Galatelli's argument that the Nazis won power legally and by consent. So what we're focusing on here is really the Nazi seizure of power. And I know that you've covered that fairly recently, okay? And what you'll be analysing then and evaluating then is what Richard Evans suggests about Galetelli's argument that the Nazis won power legally and by consent. So what Richard Evans does is that he critically analyzes and evaluates Galetelli's argument. And what I will then require you to do through this worksheet is to think about the ways in which Richard Evans analyzes and evaluates Galetelli's argument and the reasons he offers, the evidence he provides for deciphering Galetelli's argument. Okay, so the worksheet is what you need to do primarily. Your stretch task is to use the previous slide, so this slide, which models an evaluation of Galetelli's argument on the role of the Gestapo, to write an evaluation of his legal revolution argument. So now this is an evaluation of Galetelli's argument on the role of the Gestapo. Okay, and I've modeled this for you. Can you do something similar after completing the worksheet in relation to an evaluation of his legal revolution argument? And you'll find out more about this by reading pages 57 all the way through to 64. Okay, that's it for now, year 13s. Take care, guys.